Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Andrew Samwick, and I'm the director of the Nelson A. Rockefeller Center here at Dartmouth College. It's my pleasure to welcome you to this afternoon's public lecture, Policy at the Sharp End, Listening to the Veterans of Iraq and Afghanistan, to be presented by Sidney J. Freedberg, Jr. It is our custom at the Rockefeller Center to close our fall term public programs with an event commemorating Veterans Day. We are busily at work on an exciting and educational set of programs for the winter term. I encourage you all to check our website, or since websites are so passé, Twitter or Facebook or all the different places we are, to find out what's coming your way in the winter term. Today's program is also presented in support of the Dartmouth Center's forum theme of Speak Out, Listen Up. Many times in the course of public discussions about our military policy, there are officials or pundits or journalists who purport to speak for the military. In fact, I would rather get my information from the source. And in fact, our guest this evening has spent the last 6 years of his professional life doing just that. As a defense reporter for the National Journal until earlier this year, Sidney Freedberg spent hundreds of hours interviewing military personnel about their experiences in Afghanistan and Iraq. This oral history project gives voice to the direct experiences of officers and seasoned non-commissioned officers on critical issues related to the challenges we face in that theater, whether it's counterinsurgency tactics, military technology, or the effects of extended and multiple deployments of military personnel. His work complements the work being done within the armed forces to learn their lessons from the ground up, and importantly, it holds that process to a very high standard. Since leaving the National Journal, Mr. Freedberg has continued his work in a new venture. I guess we could have had you here for the Portman lecture last evening. It's called Policy at the Sharp End. And in this new project, he endeavors to do three things. First, to inform and influence the policy debate through deeply researched analyses. We'll get a chance to see what that looks like this afternoon. To help bridge the gap between the American people and their military. And thirdly, to record, preserve, and share veterans' recollections for scholarly research. In addition to his oral history project, he's working on a book with the tentative and quite modest title of A Citizen's Guide to the Next War. I found that idea provocative and fascinating because it seems like every country faces the challenge of being prepared at the very best only to fight the last war. Mr. Freedberg has been one of the leading voices on the forward edge of commentary on military affairs. After graduating from Harvard College, summa cum laude, and earning a master's degree in modern European history at Cambridge, he spent a year at the New Republic and then joined the National Journal in 1997. He was writing about homeland security as early as 1998. He was writing about military transformation as early as 1999 and about asymmetric warfare in 2000. We are very grateful to Mr. Freedberg for joining us this afternoon and for sharing the stories with us that we all need to hear on Veterans Day. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Sidney J. Freedberg.
Thank you very much. And good afternoon. Thank you all for coming. Well, I have PowerPoint. Any of you who actually has been in the military may groan now. But I promise there are only 15 slides. There are no bullet points. There is no embedded video. It's all pretty pictures, or not so pretty pictures in the case of some of them of wounded personnel, but those are only in the backup slides. It's not really the theme of this lecture or this week, this year's project at Dartmouth, or my whole project to hear what I have to say. It's to hear what they have to say. So I want to introduce you to Major Chris Faught, United States Marine Corps, a Cobra helicopter pilot who fought over Fallujah. Fortunately, he did not go down and have to fight in Fallujah, although some of his comrades did. Who has seen comrades die both in training, accidents, and in the war.
Putting a yellow sticker on the back of your car and I support your troops, I could care less. What I want you to do is educate yourself and vote. and don't cry the crocodile tears for Mike Martino, who sucked up a man pad over Ramadi and is now a name on a wall. Spend those lives wisely. I am an instrument of the executive branch of the United States, and I execute foreign policy.
That is basically the manifesto for what I've been trying to do for the last 6 years. I am not doing human interest stories. I am not holding these up as icons of civic virtue. I am not here today or ever to praise heroes, although there are some. I am not here to pity victims of this war, although there are many. I am not here to condemn war criminals, although I have interviewed one guy who narrowly escaped conviction of shooting an unarmed prisoner. I am here to tell you what experts, professionals, have to say about what it takes to implement national policy at the sharp end. And it's the product of the title of the project. I am also not here to debate whether we should have or should not have invaded Iraq, or whether we should get out of Iraq or Afghanistan. I am not here to sing the praises of or bury the Bush, Rumsfeld, Bremer administration, who made horrific mistakes in implementation, which costs thousands of American and Iraqi and Afghan lives, but which do not do so alone. I love the Army. My father was in the Army in World War II. The Army made tremendous mistakes. The Army leadership is responsible for much of the blood that was shed. And it has made remarkable adaptations, as has the military as a whole. I'm focusing on the Army because I know them best. It's made remarkable adaptations, but it has a long way to go. It is still struggling. And this really bottom-up evolution has impacts on weapons procurement, on the number of troops we have or need to have, on the organization of units, on professional military education, on the nature of our society and how we divide responsibilities for who fights and who stays home, which is very different from today from the way it was most of American history. So, on that particular point, this is the moonscape chart produced by the incomparable Ryan Morris of National Journal, originally in 2006. He's one of the great graphic designers, the best I've ever worked with. He updated it for me just a few days ago, so our post 9/11 figures are actually up to date. There's a lot going on in this. What is it? Okay, the planets or moons on the top represent the number of Americans serving in each conflict. Through World War II, that's basically everyone in the military. Post-World War II, that's only the people in theater. It's not quite apples and oranges, though, because we have become a global imperial power. We have large numbers of troops at any given time who are not involved in the current conflict, who are garrisoning Germany against the Soviets, who are in South Korea, et cetera, et cetera. The bottom planets, which are not to scale with the top ones, represent the number of those Americans who died. Through the Civil War, about half of these are from disease. By World War I, there's still a lot of accidents, so-called non-hostile casualties, but the disease deaths have gone down. Down there at the bottom is actually a percentage of these people up top who actually died. And there's a long curve of, this is percent of GDP, gross domestic product, spent on defense year by year. There's an interesting pattern that, we'll come back to that in a minute. But context here, historical context for these relatively small circles and relatively small GDP spikes over here. That's post 9/11 in the context of 235 years of history since Lexington conquered. In context, and not to diminish what anyone has done in this war, or the human tragedies or the heroism of this war. This is not big. This is not Vietnam. This is not World War II. Certainly not the Civil War, which is still the worst in our history. In part because both sides were Americans killing each other. Sort of a twofer. The GDP figures for the Civil War, by the way, are Union only. The Confederates had hyperinflation. Their records were lost. You can't reconstruct that. So that figure probably should be higher. Now, also another caveat. This is not a big war for us. It's a very big war for the Iraqis. It is an unprecedented catastrophe. Well, since 1258 when the Mongols burned Baghdad. It's a pretty big catastrophe for them. It is medium-sized for the Afghans only in context of 30 years of pretty much apocalyptic devastation. This is Afghan civilian casualties per month. This is not a Ryan Morris graphic. This is this thing I clutched together. You can see why I need Ryan. But green is what the Taliban kills. Red is what we and our allies and the Afghans kill. Yellow is undetermined. This adds up. You can see the spikes in the summer months, the fighting season. This is UN data. This adds up to about 1,800 or 2,000 civilians killed per year. That is fairly horrific. However, in the Afghan context, that's actually kind of peaceful. In a single year, in a single city, namely Kabul, in 1994, 25,000 civilians were killed, largely because Gulbuddin Hekmatyar, one of the worst people on earth, put half of Kabul under siege. So, in context, horrific for them, but for us, going back to this slide, this is a relatively small, manageable war without a huge impact on our economy, without horrific casualties. That's what, 0.3%, I think, compared to 13% of everybody who went off to the Civil War didn't come back. And although this is a fair, moderate figure, it's actually not a huge impact on our society because, well, that's a reasonably large circle, what, 600 plus thousand deployed. Those people are relatively isolated from the 99% of American society that is not involved with the armed forces. That's a profound cultural and political issue that I'll talk about in a bit. Now, I'm focusing on the Army, and I'm using the word imperial. This is the latest update from a couple of weeks ago of what's called the Army Global Commitments slide. About 100,000 military personnel overseas in one capacity or another at any given time. You can see it's all over the planet. That's why I say imperial. And it is not confined by any means, it's disproportionately, obviously, the lion's share is in Iraq and Afghanistan. So this pattern actually started to some degree in the Cold War, but especially after the fall of the Soviet Union in 1991, when there was a lot of intervention in peacekeeping and so-called brush fire wars around the world. And that's the foreshocks of what's happened since 9/11. Now, the Army here in Iraq and Afghanistan is doing the lion's share. That blue line is the Army. That tiny line is the Coast Guard, that's the Air Force, that's the Marine Corps, that's the, what the heck is that? It's the Navy. Proportionate to the number of people deployed. And if you look at that, first of all, it's heavily Army. Second, these are the people who died. Every one too many. These are the people who left the military since they went to Iraq and Afghanistan. These are the people who stayed in. Most of the people who went to Iraq and Afghanistan have stayed in the Army. That, in many cases, means they deploy again, or 3 times, or 4 times, which has extraordinary impacts on them as individuals and on their families, which is another point I'm going to come to. Hold that thought. It also means we have both more experience and more stress than arguably any time since 1945. In 1945, we demobilized everybody. Now, if you look here, actually half the Army has had experience in Iraq and Afghanistan. Half is never deployed. That seems like a shocking figure. But in fact, there are the people who are in basic training and too young to have gone. There are people who are senior officers that are too old to go. And a whole bunch of people who are in specialties that are not relevant. The weapons testers, the acquisition corps, and so forth. The Russian language experts. Far more of those than Arabic experts, unfortunately. Those people are not deploying. The deployment rate is actually so high that this is the National Guard and Reserve, supposedly the backup force. You don't use them unless you have World War III. That was the original model. They're deploying, peaked over 200,000, 150 that Army alone. That's Army, that's everybody, that's the other services. It bottomed out still over 50,000. It's now in the 50 to 100 range. That's the number of people who ostensibly are so-called weekend warriors, who are part-time military personnel. This is a second job, who are in Iraq or Afghanistan for 4 months, 6 months, a year at a time. These are the people who originally were the institutional descendants of the Minutemen, and they're now becoming basically professional soldiers. Now, there are 4 shocks of what happened in the 1990s. The Islamic world heats up, has been heating up ever since 1979 with the Iranian Revolution. We had Somalia, which should have been a warning of how fast a stabilization, humanitarian mission can go south. It was not a warning really understood. We had the Balkans, where we actually learned the wrong lesson that so-called military operations other than war, which itself is a dismissive term, and war could be separated. That you could do all fighting, and then the fighting would end, and you would do what was called Phase 4, which is the peacekeeping stabilization part. Now, this is what Lieutenant Colonel Eric Schwartz has to say on that transition. He commanded one of the armored units that went on the thunder runs into Baghdad, basically loading up for bear and dragging through the streets at about 5 miles an hour, shooting up everything. The first one was pretty intense. Everybody was shooting at them. The second one, the defense had basically broken. And instead of dragging the city and coming out, they decided to stay. And within about 72 hours, the resistance had ceased. And mission accomplished, as they said. Well, perhaps not.
I will tell you, for me, it happened on the 11th at 10 o'clock in the morning. And anybody that writes doctrine or teaches at an Army school will tell you that you'll never be able to pin down the moment that you transition to Phase 4. But for me, it was like an epiphany. I realized exactly what was happening when we were transitioning from 3 to 4, from major combat operations to stability operations, and it was not good.
Was not good.
No, it was not good.
Because?
Because I was I had a third of Baghdad that I was responsible for, and I was only there with about 800 of my closest friends. And
that's 3 million people.
Yeah, easily, yep. And there were the lull, or the quiet period after the 11th, really broke, and then widespread looting occurred. Looting, I've never seen this looting on television or even written about much in books, but I will tell you that that city erupted in a Mardi Gras fashion like you can't imagine. Millions of people that were looting everything that they could potentially loot in that city. From, I mean, they were pulling switch plates off of rooms, they were pulling wires out of homes, they were pulling, you name it. I mean, they'd take the buttons off your shirt if you stood still.
Now, the flip side of the looters, and the best and most organized looters who got away with the most stuff, were actually Saddam's people who had planned and prepped for this, and were getting the seed money for what became the insurgency. But the flip side to the looters is all the ordinary Iraqis who stayed home, got the old AK-47 off the shelf, locked the door, and pray that no one would break it down. And actually, nobody did. The evil Americans didn't eat them. Saddam didn't take revenge. There was this weird period of calm. And there were tremendously high expectations that the Americans, who had put a man on the moon, et cetera, could do something. Except that we had actually no plan. The official after-action report of the 3rd Infantry Division, U.S. Army, which seized Baghdad, says we had no plan for Phase 4, let alone the resources to do it.
They had so much faith in us. They were so patient. They believed that we were really going to be able to bring stability and to put a government back in place. Although they never talked government, but it was always, just let us go back to work. Let us figure this out. Just give us security. That's all they wanted.
And you couldn't do that.
Not even close.
The irony is that we had gotten really, really good at conventional war, and we were utterly unprepared for what happened when we sort of knew peacekeeping. We thought we knew peacekeeping. We weren't utterly prepared for what happened when conventional war gave way to need to do both reconstruction and fighting guerrillas at the same time. The little secret of the Afghan operation in 2001, 2002 was actually remarkably conventional. Everyone thinks about special forces guys on horseback, who are the most irregular of the American military. What we did actually against the Taliban was a conventional war. That's why we did it so well. The Taliban and the Northern Alliance were staring at each other across no man's land from trench systems that looked like something out of the Western Front in World War I. This is a perfect target for heavy bombers. You don't actually need to have smart bombs, although it certainly helps. The reason that bin Laden was valuable to the Taliban and was hosted by the Taliban had nothing to do with him being an international terrorist. That was kind of a pain in the ass. The reason was that when you hear about all those guys who went through al-Qaeda training camps, those were not being trained as terrorists. Only the cream of the crop got pulled aside for the terrorism training. They were being trained as shock troops and formed the elite of the Taliban's army, a special foreign legion of Arab fanatics, whom the native Afghans were kind of leery of, who were the best, most motivated, most fanatical unit in a conventional war. And once we bombed those conventional formations and they dispersed and went to the hills in Tora Bora and Shah-e-Kot, Operation Anaconda, we actually had a hell of a lot of time coming to grips with them. We lost bin Laden at Tora Bora because we weren't able to put our own troops on the ground in an unconventional context. And we walked into an ambush at Shah-e-Kot in Operation Anaconda because we were expecting, well, these are guerrillas. The problem will be keeping them from running away. Turned out the problem was getting our guys out again because they were standing and fighting. Something we saw also with Hezbollah in Lebanon in 2006. One of the scarier lessons of the last 10 years is that what we thought were guerrilla forces can, as in Fallujah, as in Lebanon, as in Shah-e-Kot, really stand and fight. We should have learned this in Vietnam with Dien Bien Phu, but we didn't. Or with Nha Drang, or with some of the other fights, Khe Sanh. But we forgot all that guerrilla forces can actually fight very hard against powerful conventional opponents, and that conventional armies like the North Vietnamese regulars, or what the Taliban had been before we came in, can very quickly switch to guerrilla tactics. It's a concept called hybrid war. It's not genuinely new, but people are getting better at it, and the technology, the proliferation of cheap anti-aircraft and anti-tank weapons, like the one that took out Major Fott's colleague over Ramadi, makes it much easier to do that switching back and forth. And of course, 2003, the invasion of Iraq, very conventional. The apogee of blitzkrieg, air-ground, high-speed warfare, non-linear, not about holding ground. And we did it very well. Then we discovered we actually didn't know what to do next. Now, as a result, we have seen immense adaptation in the Army and the other services, but the Army had, frankly, the most to learn, had forgotten the most after Vietnam, unlike the Marines, who preserved a small wars tradition. but the Army had forgotten the most, had the most to learn, suffered the most casualties. And this change was bottom up. And that is in large part why I find it so interesting to talk to the career sergeants and the junior officers and the mid-grade officers and speak to very few privates and very few generals. Because the people actually fighting this war, people actually making the critical decisions with strategic impact in many cases, were at those levels. In a maneuver war, a Patton or an Eisenhower is making critical decisions about where to move those big units on the map. In a guerrilla war, those big units are static, and there's a lot of fear we may have lost our capacity to maneuver. Those big units are static, they are resource providers, they are coaches, and the actual players on the field who are using those resources are the small units led by the more junior people. And that's where the innovation has come from. It's come through guys emailing their friends who have been in Iraq saying, hey, we're deploying in 6 months, tell me everything you know. Did you come up with a database of the tribal leaders in this area? I hear from my friend that you were deployed to this part of Al-Anbar or this part of Baghdad. What'd you learn? Because there was no database system. Everybody invented this on the fly and had to ad hoc it from one unit to the next when they rotated out. People were grabbing Arabic language role players. People were inserting into basic rifleman training women and children. So all of a sudden, it was not just how fast you shot and how accurately, but whether you did not shoot in certain circumstances, which is commonplace in police training and law enforcement training, but is not commonplace historically in the military. So there's extraordinary adaptation, and there is this hybridization of what you consider conventional high-end tank warfare and low-end hearts and minds, so-called low-intensity warfare. I talked to an Army major who was a captain during the surge, Jeff Rosen, who talked to me about going out working with informants, working the population, getting covert sources to direct his raids. But the roadside bombs outside his outpost, and he was doing the classic counterinsurgency thing. He was in among the people, not in a big base, just his one company in an abandoned building with some barbed wire. And I think no running water and other fun stuff. But alongside all this counterinsurgency classic doctrine, the roadside bombs, especially the Iranian-built so-called explosively formed projectiles, basically shooting molten copper at you at supersonic speeds, were so dangerous. He could not go out in up-armored Humvees. He could not actually even necessarily go out in his 35-ton Bradley armored personnel carriers. He had to lead his columns with a 70-ton, heavily armored M1 Abrams main battle tank designed to take a Soviet 125mm cannon shell to the front armor and have it bounce. He had to lead the column with those to ensure surviving the roadside bombs. And then he could go see his informant. That's what it took. So low-intensity warfare? No. The other little details, he had to use his troops to shut down the entire block every time he went to see an informant. Because he learned if you just went to the informant's house and came out again and didn't have him dragged in as a prisoner or pretend prisoner, that guy would be dead within 24 hours. There's an entire family of Iraqi Christians he worked with who got killed before he figured this out. So he had to shut down the whole block and pretend to be doing a block sweep, a coordinate search operation, when in fact all he cared about was getting himself into one house unnoticed to talk to his informant. That is a level of subtlety and of lethality that neither law enforcement nor the military have traditionally had to deal with. They do now. Now, there's a tremendous professionalism, but very different professionalism than the 90s or certainly the 80s when it was about massive firepower. I talked to another young officer, an Air Force captain named Tom Harney, who flies an A-10 so-called Warthog attack plane, who boasted not about destroying the enemy, although he certainly did that, but of a mission he flew over Afghanistan in which there were Taliban in one house and in the next compound over, next farmhouse over, not cheek by jowl, there were kids who later turned out to have stab wounds because the Taliban had forced them in there as human shields. He and his lead pilot, he was the junior guy in that two-ship flight, went in, marked the area with smoke, got confirmation they'd marked the right house, blew up the house with the Taliban in it. The house with the kids in it was untouched. And the next part of the mission was to escort the medevac helicopter in to protect the kids, take the kids out to a US hospital. That is not what we were doing in World War II when we killed lots of French people liberating France, let alone Germans or Japanese. That's not what we did in Vietnam, where we bombed the village in order to save it. It's a new level of discrimination and sophistication. Now, there are also big problems with this generational change. This is another Ryan Morris chart, so it actually doesn't hurt your eyes. This shows how the Army gets its people. This is quantity. That starts 1975, just after the draft ends, goes to 2008, but the trends continue. That is the number of new recruits who come in every year. See, it drops and basically bottoms out. This is the number of people who have been in already who re-enlist every year. That number stays level, but the Army shrinks. So the ratio of veterans to new guys, or what they were called in Vietnam, FNGs, effing new guys, the ratio of experienced people to the Army as a whole has gone up dramatically. Those people, of course, are further removed from civilian life, which has consequences for the Republic. That also means they actually know what they're doing. We have an unfortunate pattern in our history of underspending on defense in peacetime and then spiking in the crisis, spike. And what that means is, for example, the Battle of Bull Run, where both armies have no clue what they're doing, but the Union has even less clue, because they're basically civilians who felt patriotic and grabbed a gun. And God bless them, but they died in droves and the rest of them ran. The Greatest Generation is in part great because they went into battle with inadequate leadership. Even Eisenhower had never commanded anything larger than a battalion of a few hundred guys before he was commander of the entire alliance force in Europe. Inadequate senior leadership, junior officers who were 90-day wonders, trained for 3 months, inadequate training, inadequate weaponry like the Sherman tank, and, by the way, a personnel system, same one we used in Vietnam, where individuals are treated as interchangeable parts and thrown in and out of units without any chance to form cohesive teams. There were cases in the Battle of the Bulge, or Hurricane Forest, where guys were dropped off the back of the truck and told your unit's somewhere out that way. Find it. Never came back, of course. Cases in Vietnam where a guy hit his 365 days in country. The helicopter came to bring in supplies in the middle of a firefight or take the wounded out. He got in the helicopter and went home. You cannot build a cohesive team that way. We have now stopped that. We now send units over as a whole. We still have trouble with turnover, but it's very different. This, however, is the measure of quality of recruits. These are the new recruits who have high school diplomas. This is the enlisted ranks. I'm not talking about officers. This is the number who have GEDs. You can see we have a lot of non-high school graduates, no diploma, no GED, no nothing in the early years, the so-called hollow army after the draft ends. But that is soon corrected. We have almost no GEDs, actually a quota limiting GEDs, and a lot of high school graduates. These are not dumb grunts. And a lot of times they use the GI Bill to go into college, and there are some people at Dartmouth, probably some in the audience today, who have done that. The reason for the GED, by the way, is not that those are dumb people, but there's a statistical correlation between not finishing high school, even if you went on to get your GED later, and not completing basic training, which costs the Army time and money. So they historically do not like GEDs. But as you can see, since 9/11, the way they've kept up those numbers, the way they've kept that line straight, is by relaxing their standards on education. The number of GED holders has gone way up. The number of high school graduates has gone way down. That's not what they wanted to do. And that has consequences in terms of washouts in basic training. Drill sergeants also say there are issues with physical fitness in this generation, too many video game players, not enough guys running around the backwoods shooting each other with BB guns and getting into fights. This is the officers. This is how likely you are to get promoted when you're eligible to the next rank. And historically, we were very selective. In the 80s, we were very selective. Less than 20% of eligible lieutenant colonels made to colonel. Only a little more than half of eligible majors made to lieutenant colonel. Only a little more than half of eligible captains made to major. Even in the 90s, those lines were going up. We were becoming less selective. We were losing too many junior officers. Too many captains said, screw this, I'm out of here. I've done my commitment of 5 or 4 years. I'm gone. I'm going to be an investment banker. I have leadership skills. I have great credentials. I'm going to go. I'm going to make some money. I'm not going to have to deploy for my family, go train in the desert. As a result, the guys who were left got promoted at higher and higher rates. And now, with this war, we are promoting majors and lieutenant colonels at nearly 100%. If you have not screwed up and gotten a lot of your guys killed or gotten on CNN looking like an asshole, you will be promoted. This is not, again, what they wanted to do. Now, the upside is that almost all these guys now have combat experience. 50% of the population as a whole, most of the officers. Would you rather have a high school diploma graduate with no combat experience in your patrol? Would you rather have a guy who dropped out of high school, scraped by to get his GED, but he's been in Iraq before? Now, I think everyone knows the obvious answer to that. So we have an unprecedented level of combat experience, never since 1945 and arguably not even World War II, because that war didn't go on as long. The downside is unprecedented stress on the force. We have a rising number of people who are non-deployable, that is, who are physically injured or have gone too much and have clocked out and who cannot be sent. Went from 10% a few years ago, 14% now in the Army. Now we're talking about, in a few years, 16%. That's 1 in 6 people in a combat unit will be not eligible to deploy. They hurt their back driving in an MRAP. I heard that a lot. Not anything dramatic, but believe me, there are some people with some serious dramatic problems. There are people like Air Force General Sergeant Simpson here, who have post-traumatic stress disorder. Nobody is entirely sure how many. People don't report this. They're afraid for their careers. They're afraid they'll be mocked by their comrades or treated as broken. They don't report it. There's a big issue with getting confidential resources for counseling outside the Army, because Army psychologists are required to report your problems to the chain of command if they might affect your combat performance. They do not have confidentiality protection. There are lots of these so-called invisible wounds. RAND study called Invisible Wounds of War estimated they couldn't even count traumatic brain injuries or severe concussions. But their guesstimate of post-traumatic stress disorder or major depression was 300,000 cases. As of 2007, that's 3 years ago. That's before the surge, some of the worst fighting in the war. Everybody has some combat stress.
I still get lack of sleep. I still get my dreams. I was never hit with an IED or whatever. And so one of the anger issues, too, is I can't, the dreams wake me up, the dead bodies. And it's not like a dream, per se, like I'm seeing this happening or I'm running through a field and I trip over dead. It's not like that. It's just my dreams are slideshows. Pictures and pictures of the dead bodies are coming through, the tortured bodies. I can tell you some stories about tortured people that you just think, wow, they can actually do that to people. But I would see that, and so I would wake up, and I still to this day, and I smell burnt flesh. Smell it. And it's so real to me. And so the only way for me to get it is I actually get out, and I get in a shower. I take a shower, and I know it's in my mind, but to me that is the only way to get rid of the burnt smell, is for me to shower. And so at 2 in the morning, I'm getting up and showering. It hasn't happened in, I would say, about a week, but I usually have those dreams about once or twice a week. Me and my wife were, I don't want to say we're on the way out, but we had a lot of arguments and everything, and I wanted to say a lot of it perpetuated from me. I didn't like things. I was rigid. I demanded things to be my way. And there's actually times where I would get so mad. I remember one, I didn't want to take my anger out on my kids or my wife, and I did my damnedest not to. And there was one, I just got so mad, I just went to the garage and closed the garage and just started to cry.
Now, everyone has some degree of post-combat stress. People are actually trying to use the term, can you still hear me? Yeah, okay, PTS, as opposed to PTSD. The D is problematic. We didn't even have PTSD as a diagnosis in Vietnam, and that hurt a lot of people who were not what was going on with them was not understood. And having the diagnosis in the psychiatric manuals is a big advance. But there's a lot of debate about redefining it, because there really is a spectrum of stress reactions. And come on, if people are trying to kill you, it is normal and healthy to have a stress reaction, and it's hard to turn that off when you come home. Your mind is telling you you are safe. Your body may take a while to figure that out. There's a spectrum of reactions from post-traumatic stress disorder to short-term adjustment disorders, where people get over it. They have bad dreams. They drive on the road too fast. They look for roadside bombs, even though they're back in Boise, Idaho. They wake up in the night and patrol the house, even though they know it's ridiculous because they're safe at home. They're on a military base where there are armed guards around them and nobody to come and get them. But that ends for those people. For most people, that ends. It goes all the way on the far end to what's called post-traumatic growth, which is a controversial concept, but the argument that some people are stronger in the broken places, that they rise to the challenge, they grow and thrive. There is even the argument, and I'm not sure I buy it, that if your family was in trouble before, if you had marital problems before, deployment will make them worse. If your marriage was strong before, it will make it stronger. I don't know if that's true. I don't know if that's true. I know that there are people in treatment for PTSD. They're either drugs, virtual reality, talk therapy. I've talked to a Marine who does a yoga class. So there are ways to actually, even for the full-fledged PTSD disorder, to at least get the symptoms under control and possibly even cure it. This is going to be a decade-long project. This is not going to end when we get out our last troops out of Afghanistan, if we ever do. Now, the other point I want to drive home with this slide is the families are affected. You want to have a long-term problem. What is going to be happening with these kids in 20 years, in 30 years, when they become parents, when they become grandparents? How is their dad having to go into the garage and cry because he didn't want to scare them by breaking a lamp going to affect those kids? We don't know. There have been studies of Holocaust survivors' children in the Israeli army that show that a parent with PTSD predisposes you to PTSD yourself. This is actually a generational issue. But PTSD is treatable. It is possibly even completely curable. We don't really know. And there needs to be more research, there needs to be more support, and there need to be more confidential resources outside the chain of command. Now, we do know that family members can get post-traumatic stress disorder. I talked to one general's wife, Mrs. Phillips, and I don't have time for her audio too, sadly, but she was on the phone with her husband. He was in the green zone. He was a general. He was in a relatively safe billet. He wasn't out in an up-armored Humvee or walking point in the mountains of Afghanistan. He was on the phone with her. They heard a little whistling noise in the background, and then a boom from a rocket attack or a mortar. The insurgents would set these on timers, run away, and let them launch when they'd gotten clear. And the green zone's big, you can hit it. And you can probably damage something anywhere you hit. The line went dead. Dawn Phillips, the general's wife, said she fell down on the floor and cried because she was sure her husband of 30 years was dead. 20 minutes later, he got a working phone line and said, no, the phone system went down, I'm fine. Wasn't anywhere near me. But this is a woman who has talked openly about having strong suicidal impulses after her husband got back. When he had to go leave the house on military duty for training or conferences, she was left alone in the house, their kids were grown. She felt several times like committing suicide. She was never in Iraq or Afghanistan. Now, even if you do not develop full-fledged PTSD as a family member or get divorced, or if you're a kid act out in school, there is still tremendous stress. Matt McCollum went to Afghanistan. His brother had actually died in Afghanistan. Angel McCollum, his wife, got through the whole tour, 12 months, okay. They have 2 little boys. She actually managed to take them from one base and move them to another base where her husband was going to be assigned after he got back from Afghanistan. So when he got back, he couldn't come right home to them. He actually had to be in a motel room on the old base doing the bureaucracy, getting the paperwork done, so he could actually come home to them. And they would talk on the phone every day, except
when he was at Fort Hood trying to sign out, I called him one evening, and it was like 9:30 or 10 o'clock at night because I just wanted to say goodnight, tell him we're so glad he's home, that kind of thing. He wasn't there. He didn't answer. And I immediately got panicked. I said, oh my goodness, somebody has murdered him in his hotel room. Something bad has happened. I just completely, my anxiety just all came coming down. And I was so upset, and I kept calling. It got to 11 o'clock, and my husband still wasn't there. I was like, something is wrong. I was just on the verge, because my husband's such a family man. We're in bed by 9:30, 10 o'clock. We're not late night owls. We're just not that way. I was completely panicked. And by 11:30, I was ready to call the front desk to have them key into his room to make sure he wasn't dead, because I was scared to death. And I get this call, and it's from Matt. He goes, hey, were you trying to call me? And I was like, where have you been? And he goes, oh, I was just out. I said, what do you mean you're out? I said, this is not the time for a married man to be out. I was like, what are you doing? And I was so mad, and you could hear all the anxiousness in my voice and everything else. And he said, you are completely overreacting. And I said, you know what? I'll talk to you when I calm down. I'm not ready to talk to you right now. So I hung up the phone. I got myself together. And I called him back. And I said, okay, Matt, I just have a couple things to say to you. He said, what is it? I said, number one, did you pray for me every single night that you were gone that somebody wouldn't shoot me or blow me up or kill me or drag my body through the streets? He said, no. I said, did you pray for me every night that I wouldn't have a heart attack from the stress of the responsibility of what was on my shoulders? Did you pray for me every night for that? He said, no, honey, I didn't. I said, well, until you've walked a mile in my shoes, you are not qualified to tell me if I'm overreacting. And that's when it all came in onto him, and he goes, oh, honey, I'm so sorry. I said, Matt, I have been holding your vigil. I have been waiting for you to come home. I said, when you did something out of the normal, I panicked. I said, because I was sure that something had happened to you. I said, until you have prayed those prayers for me every night, until you've worried that, and I said, until you've rocked your sons to sleep and assured them as they were crying that Daddy would be okay and that things were going to be all right, I said, you have no right to tell me I overreacted. And that's the only argument we had.
And I'm not going to cry. I did when I was typing the transcript up for the article it was in, but I'm not going to do that now. Now, Mrs. McCollum you can see her with a little gift basket here, is actually involved with something called the FRG, the Family Readiness Group. It's another thing that started in the 90s, but is now a big deal. It started out as the wives, and it was the wives, for generations, informally coming together to buck each other up while the men were away, to bring the food and to bring the comfort when somebody was killed or injured. But it was historically informal. In fact, it was kind of scorned by the Army. The Army's attitude was, if we'd wanted you to get married, we'd have issued you a wife. We'd have issued you kids. General Phillips, whose wife got PTSD, was told when he was a young lieutenant, and his wife nearly died in childbirth from complications, nearly lost her and the baby, he was told, why didn't you come into work on time this morning? I was in the hospital with my wife. Why didn't you come to work on time? That has changed. It's one of the generational changes we saw starting in the 90s. And in recent years, for the first time ever, family readiness groups are not all volunteers. They actually have paid administrative assistants. So the moms and the wives don't have to deal with their kids and their own personal stress and each other's stress and keep up the email list and the phone tree. That is a revolution in the Army. And there are all sorts of services, the yoga classes on base that these Marines I was talking to were taking. The chaplaincy, which actually has confidentiality protection, unlike Army psychiatrists. The Veterans Administration, or Department of Veteran Affairs, which has a long-standing network of care that's actually one of the best medical systems in the country right now, radically overhauled in the 1990s. But at the same time, the stress is rising faster than the resources are rising. It is a Red Queen's race. You have to stay in the same place, you have to run really fast. And all this is happening in relative isolation from us, the 99% of American society that does not go and fight, does not in the military, married to the military, the child of the military, the grandfather, the close friend. Now, we talk about lack of representation. I want to make clear, and this is another ugly me chart, not a beautiful Ryan chart. I apologize. This is not about racial disproportion. The Army is actually racially kind of reflective of America, and contrary to the whole, it's the poor black kids who go to war and so forth, which may or may not have been true in Vietnam. The number of African Americans in the Army, which historically had overrepresentation of blacks, because it was a great opportunity, in a culture that was otherwise, remains otherwise, not as colorblind as it thinks it is. The number of blacks in the Army has gone down, even in the 90s, and dropped dramatically since 9/11. The number of Hispanics has risen very slightly, not as fast as the population of Hispanics has increased in this country. There's actually a very high propensity to serve among Hispanics. A lot of them are very interested in the military, very patriotic, in some ways especially the new immigrants and the non-citizens. But that GED high school diploma thing gets them, in part because a lot of Hispanics drop out of school. I'm talking about immigrants primarily here. A lot of Hispanics drop out of school to support their families, to help mom and dad and Tia with the family budget. They don't finish high school at the rates other ethnic groups do. Therefore, they're disqualified from joining the Army. And the other services even more so, which have even higher educational standards. This last line, I have politically incorrect colors, I know. There's black, and there's sort of brownish, and there's yellow for Asians and other groups. I'm sorry. I thought that would be better than completely arbitrary colors. This is sort of a steady constant. And here is the white guys. Steady, steady, about representative of the population, a little bit lower. Steady, up, up, up. Look at the casualties, the people who have died in this war, even more remarkable. Okay, this is the percentage of casualties of killed who are each race. 10% of blacks, 10% of Hispanics, 75% of the killed are white, 5% other. This is the proportion in the Army the military as a whole, all services, excuse me, who are black, Hispanic, white, other. This is the proportion of the US population, the comparable age groups. Black, Hispanic, white, other. You see that blacks are now actually underrepresented in the military, overrepresented in the Army, but certain other branches historically less accepting, and historically not as many blacks in them. They're underrepresented among the casualties. They're overrepresented still in the Army and the military as a whole. There are more blacks in the military than there are in the civilian population, same age groups. Fewer among the dead in this war. Hispanics, underrepresented, but casualties and the proportion of the military pretty much line up. Whites, slightly underrepresented in the force, massively overrepresented among the dead. And that is in part because certain career fields like special forces, for all sorts of reasons, some of them kind of ugly, are disproportionately white. And that is because the combat arms, people like infantry, are disproportionately white. Historically, and I'm making a generalization here, I'm not talking about Colin Powell, for example. Historically, blacks are more likely, on average, to enter the Army with the objective of getting good job skills and opportunities and money for college that historically in our society are not well available to them elsewhere. They tend to go into technical or administrative jobs, and they tend, therefore, to be non-combat personnel, disproportionately. Talking about averages here. White people in the military are more likely to come from families that hunt, families that camp out, families that have a military tradition in a small town. They're therefore more likely to opt for combat arms, especially infantry and special forces. They are more likely to die. So whatever this is not a poor black kids' war. In that way, the Army is not unrepresentative of the US population. But it is unrepresentative in other ways. This is Army again only. The last slide was all military. This is only Army. And we're coming to the end, I promise. This is a Ryan slide. It's what's called a heat graph. It's a complex way of averaging out. So if one zip code has 100 recruits in a year and the next zip code has 0, you average them both out to 50 on the map. That's how they deal with local variation. Otherwise, it would be unintelligible. And you can see it's not too bad. The areas where there are a lot of recruits map the areas where there are a lot of people. The West Coast, the East Coast, the Southeast, Chicago, Heartland area. But there's definitely some overrepresentation of the South. There's overrepresentation of rural areas because of cultural factors. The rural population is overrepresented in the military, especially in those combat arms. It's the kids who hunt and shoot and like to go out in the woods who tend to be more likely to opt for infantry and to go for special forces. Now, the fascinating thing that Ryan Morris, the graphics and statistics I found out when he ran this data, which I had not realized until he actually came back to me and said, look at this. The 21 zip codes that have the highest number of Army recruits over the last 8 years, 2001 to 2008 actually, it's old data but the patterns hold, are all near Army bases. They're just outside the gate. There are 2 more zip codes outside the US that have the top levels of recruits in this top category. They are in Samoa and Guam, which are areas with huge disproportionate military populations and military bases. This is another example of the relative isolation of the armed forces from the rest of our society. Many times, what we're seeing with these 21 zip codes is the children of military personnel enlisting as military personnel. So not merely a much more professional military, a military that stays in longer, that re-enlists more, but to some degree, we are seeing the first inklings of a hereditary military class. Now, all this is great for the military as an instrument of national policy. They are more professional. They're, in cases of the children of military personnel or people who grew up just outside the base, they are familiar with the military from their youth. They have imbibed certain values that are at odds with the mainstream of society, but which are essential for military service, like self-sacrifice, like obedience to orders. Although drill sergeants say that this generation talks back and asks why a lot more than they did when they were in boot camp. But this increases the isolation of the armed forces from the rest of the population which they serve. This is, in short, great for the military as an instrument of national policy. It makes it much more effective than the guys at Bull Run or Casserine Pass or in Vietnam who were sent in undertrained, underprepared, poorly equipped, and who died unnecessarily until we figured it out. These guys don't do that. Even in Iraq and Afghanistan, while they had a big learning curve on counterinsurgency, they did not make the dumb mistakes that we did in World War II, for example. They did not break and run like the guys at Bull Run. It's good for the military as a tool. I am not sure it is good for the republic. And trying to bridge that gap between the policymakers and the military who implement their policy, and between the military and the people, we the people of the United States, to provide for the common defense, enact this Constitution, which the military is sworn to support and defend against all enemies, foreign and domestic. We the people need to understand. We actually need to have a basic education in the art of war, just as we have basic sex education now. You know, you shouldn't let kids learn about sex on the street, right? But that's where people learn about war. Media, offhand remarks. There's no education in it. And we have all the misconceptions about the military that 2 generations ago had about sex as a result. They didn't get sex, we don't get death. And trying to bridge that gap and educate people to put at least one strand of the rope bridge across that chasm is what this lecture is about. It's what my life's work is about. And what this conversation today, I hope, will be about. And with that, having run a few minutes over, I want to open the floor to questions. So, let's see. I know some people have to run. I'm not deeply offended. I'll just mark your names down for later. Yes, sir. Yeah, wait for the mic, because otherwise we can't hear you and it doesn't get on the tape and all those things.
If I understood you correctly, you said there was a very high level of re-enlistment among people who had had at least one posting in these war zones.
Yes.
That would seem to be counterintuitive given the difficulty of all. What do you think accounts for that?
There's a remarkable number of people who re-enlist in the war zone. You can't leave, and unlike Vietnam, you don't go home from the war zone when your time is up, but your unit's still there. We don't do that anymore. You stay till the end of your tour. That's not stop loss, it's something else, but is a voluntary extension of your contract. A lot of people re-up in the war zone. There's a practical reason for that, which is everything you earn in the war zone is tax exempt, so your re-enlistment bonus is tax exempt, which is nice. But there's also a socio-psychological dynamic at work. You know, the whole Band of Brothers phenomenon. People fight ultimately not for the cause, although this is a much more politically literate military than we had in the past. They fight for the guy on their left and the guy on their right, or increasingly the gal on their right nowadays. And when they go and forge those bonds, not just in training, which is intense enough, but in combat, in common danger, they want to stay with those people. So yes, deployment burns people out, but it also binds them more closely together and makes them want to stay, even at considerable personal sacrifice. That's part of the reason why we still have such high re-enlistment rates, why those have not collapsed, amazingly. Okay. Next question. Yes, sir. Wait for the mic, please.
Very interesting discussions, and and I've learned a lot. You talked about sort of trying to bridge this chasm, and I think one of the issues that I run into, and I think maybe others do, is
The important.
And again, this is sort of averages, that on average, people in the military and with military history tend to believe in what you'd call sort of Republican ideals, small government,
Except for a big military.
Well, exactly, and so this is where I have a tough time, and I think other people have a tough time, who tend to not be from military families, tend to be sort of think on the more liberal side, and it's sort of like the people who are saying, well, get the government out of my Medicare, right? And so that's
Which, of course, is a government benefit, but never mind.
exactly. Well, that's just the point. Is that's difficult I think for some people like myself, to then understand where these people come from. I understand the patriotism part. I understand all that. I don't understand then the aspect of not supporting government spending.
Well, of course, the acquisition and procurement side of the military, which we have not talked about, is often used as a huge welfare and stimulus project by Congress. There's a lot of that. That's a whole other lecture. But someone else is more qualified to give than I am. But absolutely, you're right. There is a correlation between conservative values and more conservative parts of the country and military service. And obviously, if you're in the military, you probably don't think that guns are bad and should be banned. And those two things don't go together. So that's a natural aversion to half the Democratic Party, at least. And the half that's still around, because all the good old boys who were blue dogs and wanted to shoot their guns and have welfare programs are now out of power. But that said, there actually is a generational shift in the military. It's not merely something innate in the military mind that makes them socially conservative. In fact, in a lot of countries, the military are the revolutionaries who get frustrated with the slow pace of social reform and take over, which often has bad effects. Ataturk in Turkey, for example. But if you look at the experiences of the military, for a large portion of this century, they were on the receiving end of a lot of distrust and distaste from Democrats. And I'm a registered Democrat myself. Full disclosure, I have never voted for a Republican, except possibly David Catania, the gay candidate for council in D.C. But he would be a Democrat anywhere else. It's D.C. It's so far to the left, it fell off the edge a long time ago. But think about it. The Vietnam War. At one point, you had JFK and LBJ and the pro-war Democrats. But over time, the Democratic Party was basically taken over, sometimes by force, with them storming the floor of the convention. And yes, I know they were martyrs and all that, and they were beaten up by the police, et cetera. Yeah, I don't care. But was taken over by the anti-war movement that, frankly, got very personal about the troops. I mean, support the troops can be full of platitudes, but it's a lot better than spitting on them. A lot of guys I talked to who were from the Vietnam generation, whose dads were in the Vietnam generation, said you didn't wear a uniform off base. People would look at you funny at the very least. And there's challenge of whether the guy coming off the plane home and being spat immediately is a real story, didn't have, but people were spat on. People were abused. They were called baby killers. And that was mostly at the hands of the left. Then you had the 1980s, where we went from a hollow army, an army that had huge recruiting problems, and a military in general that was struggling to be funded, although Carter started funding it a lot more in the last years of his administration after the invasion of Afghanistan by the Russians. We had Ronald Reagan shower money on the military and shower respect on the military. We had George Bush the elder, the smart one, who took the military into its cleanest victory of all time and said, it's 100 hours, you can stop. Unfortunately, the Republican Guard got away, and Saddam remained in power, and 12 years later we had to come back. But it looked awfully good at the time. So that's great positive experience. Oh, and then Clinton, who was possibly a draft dodger, as opposed to Bush Jr., who was merely a draft wiggler-outer of, and who, actually Dick Cheney, the great hero of the military, the master of the shotgun, he actually started the steep cuts in the last years of the Bush administration, but it's blamed on Clinton. And Clinton, in turn, pursued the cuts, but then turned them around in the late 90s. But people remember the cuts. So this is not my argument. This is a young Army officer called Jason Dempsey, who's actually written a book. He's a sociologist. And he argues all the military's experiences for a generation and a half, 2 generations, were negative with Democrats and positive for Republicans. So guess what? They voted Republican. Now, for 8 years, we had some rather negative experiences for the military with Republicans. Rumsfeld really pissed off the senior folks. Bush and Rumsfeld sent the junior folks into Iraq and Afghanistan with no good plan for what to do after they won the major combat operations and had mission accomplished. And meanwhile, the Democrats, however sincerely or not, have captured to support the troops and are now waving that flag as well. And even when you look at the gays in the military surveys and studies that are being done now in the debate over whether we should lift, don't ask, don't tell, generational attitudes about homosexuality have changed. The Marine Corps is a holdout, but even I think in the Marine Corps, the younger people are probably less animated about this than the older guys. So Dempsey, whose book I believe is called Our Army or America's Army, I apologize, you can Google it, D-E-M-P-S-E-Y. He's quite brilliant. And he's back from Afghanistan, I think, by now. In between writing books, he fights wars. Argues there is a historic opportunity for the Democratic Party to recapture the military as a constituency, in much the same way that FDR was a hero to the military as he was to the civilian population. So I think the association you talk to has some roots in regional culture and the culture of the South, which after all had the best officers and probably the most motivated troops in the Civil War, as long ago as that. And there's some issues that are actually relatively short-term political issues that can go back and forth, at least between generations, as young officers come up and become the generals of tomorrow. Okay, we have time for what? Another few questions. Anybody who's had their hand, you in there in back, miss. And please wait for the mic, otherwise I can't hear you and the audio recording for history does not hear you.
Sorry, this might not be a short question.
I'll give you a long answer, don't worry.
Well, thanks for coming. And I thought it was really interesting, especially how most of your talk focused on the changing demographics in the Army and how, we're not really sure what the implications of that are going to be. And I was just wondering if you had some sort of picture of an ideal demographic for the Army in your head or an ideal setup. I know a lot of countries have different strategies with making everyone serve versus not.
Oh, that's
training.
almost all extinct now. Even the Germans have gone away from that.
Right. So I was just wondering what your kind of ideal Army demographic would be.
Well, that's a simple answer. It's an Army that exactly reflects the ethnic and socioeconomic makeup of the country, which we've never had, but would be nice. One thing I didn't discuss, and I don't have the slide of this here, but I do have backup slides, including of some really horrible things. But that the very poor don't serve, because they don't complete high school. They're not eligible. But the very rich don't serve either. That if you see American, I'll try to do a graph in the air. If you see American economic class as a bell curve, and actually it's becoming a dumbbell because the middle class is dissolving. But if you see it as roughly a bell curve, from very rich to very poor with most people in the middle, the Army and the military as a whole are a bell jar. Those ends are basically not represented. Dartmouth is great, and that's an elite educational institution that has ROTC. Yay. My own alma mater, Harvard, does not still have ROTC. You have to commute to MIT, which is not a huge commute, but it says something. It's not welcome on campus. And one of my classmates who used to draw monsters and robots for my science fiction magazine is now Air Force intelligence, and one of his big axes he grinds is more Ivy League students going into the armed forces. And there's a huge division between the policy-making and business elite of the country and the military because of this class aspect of military recruitment that I haven't even talked about, but it's a serious issue, a real serious problem. I don't otherwise have an ideal population mix. Did you have a follow-up question?
Yeah, just what about the whole gap between only 1% of the population serving? Do you think that should be different?
Well, the problem, of course, the military fought tooth and nail in the 70s not to get rid of the draft. And now they would fight tooth and nail to not get it back. Because, boy, they do not want a whole bunch of people who are in there really kind of against their will in many cases, who are not enthused, and who are in and out in 2 years. There are a lot of career fields in the military, technical fields that are becoming more and more important as technology advances. You can't actually finish training in 2 years. I mean, Arabic language skills. Arabic is hard to learn. You can't become fluent in Arabic in 2 years. Now, it's not to denigrate the people who fought, the conscripts who went into the ground forces, especially in World War II, in Vietnam, Korea. I've got guys who've been in that era and been in the volunteer era, said the draft guys fought really hard. They were, whether they were motivated when they went in or not, they were motivated in battle. But they showed less initiative, and particularly they were not on 24/7 the same way the volunteers are. They had not, in peacetime and in training, say, I want to be the best soldier I can be, damn it. I want to go, go, go. I want to do more push-ups, and I want to run more miles. I want to be the best guy in my platoon, God damn it. I chose to be here, and I'm going to be an awesome soldier. It was more attitude of, I will do what's required of me. Because it's my legal duty, it's my patriotic duty, but I'm not going to, this is not my life, and I'm not going to bust my chops over it. Once they got in battle, they busted their chops plenty, but they did not prepare as hard outside of battle, for better or for worse. Okay, we have time for probably one more question. I want to show you guys one concluding remark, not from me, but from Major Faught.
I wonder if the innovations that lieutenants, captains, lieutenant colonels in Iraq and Afghanistan, the sort of policy decisions that they made at the very local level, has undermined at all the sort of Army hierarchy and respect for more senior officers who were so far behind the curve in changing strategy.
Not as much as in Vietnam. That's for sure, where there was some pretty serious disgust from the guys who were in combat with the guys who were going on the news and saying it was all fine and we were winning. Actually, we were winning, but we weren't as winning as well as we thought we were, so when Tet occurred, we all panicked. When in fact, Tet was actually in a weird way a victory because the Viet Cong were basically wiped out. Off topic, but certainly there is a sense that, there's always been a sense in the military, because of the politics of the institution, that the best officers are the colonels who never make general. That's always been the sense. And even the really good generals, like arguably Petraeus, are highly political animals. They have to be. And when they're derided as political by other guys, it's because the other guys are political within the Army, and these guys are political within the Army and with the White House, which is seen as cheating. But there's certainly a lot of movement to change the Army personnel system so you don't have the generals promoting basically mini-me's and ignoring the guy who went to Morocco and studied Arabic for 2 years, or the guy who was on the ground in the insurgency but maybe didn't do an airborne ranger tour, so he doesn't have that badge. Is there less respect? Certainly there is less respect than there was in 1991 when they came out of what they thought was a great victory in Gulf War I. And probably less respect than there was in the 80s. I think we're better off in terms of respect for the hierarchy, good or ill, than we were in the 70s. So I'm not worried that that's a major sign of ill health in the armed forces. I can take probably one more question, then I want to wrap. Yes, ma'am, in the back over there. And again, please wait for the mic. The young lady's coming over with it.
You haven't mentioned anything about the effect of women in all of this.
Well, there are women who are going over there, and I've talked to some of them. But they are underrepresented massively. I didn't actually include the chart on that because the figures are tiny. The majority of the military is still male, and the vast majority of combat casualties are male. Now, there's actually a congressional ban on women in combat units in the Army. That is almost impossible to enforce when everybody is a combat unit, and the rear area supply guys are actually being shot at perhaps more than the frontline infantry because the bad guys stay out of the way of the guys with the guns and they go after the supply trucks. That said, it's definitely a generational change. It's way more women than Vietnam. One of the interesting and slightly ugly tidbits is when you look at divorce rates, which have gone up, although not as much as you'd expect, and I have the data for the Army only. But when you look at divorce rates, your traditional marriages where the guy is a soldier, goes off to war, and the woman is staying home with the kids, have the lowest divorce rates in the Army. That's what you kind of expect. Dual military marriages where both parents are in the military and often they have to leave the kids or they deploy back to back and they don't see each other for a year or 2 years, those guys have higher divorce rates, unsurprisingly. But the highest divorce rates are not the dual military families. They're not the families where both mom and dad deploy. They're the non-traditional marriages where dad is a civilian and stays home with the kids, and the woman goes off to war. And because that is so contrary to our 10,000 years of cultural presumptions and to ideas of what manliness consists of, that a lot of guys can't hack it. They can't do that. They can't watch her go off in harm's way while they stay with the kids. And more of those marriages break up than any other population within the military. Now, we've talked a lot about the bad stuff here, and I want to just go back to Major Faught for one last word before I let you all go.
The important thing isn't that people say, oh, too many casualties, these kids are dying. It's an all-volunteer force. So I take that obligation freely. But I don't think that diminishes that loss. It's just, that's the way it is.
Is it worth it for you to keep on living this life, to have chosen this life?
Yes, I wouldn't change anything.
Major Chris Faught, your Marine, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much. I'm here if you have any further questions.